Well, the people have spoken. The Fire Emblem series has been around for a very long time, and with over 15 games and a multitude of characters within each, it's safe to assume creating unique and original ones every time is a considerably daunting task. Thus, templates are commonly implemented as a guideline for specific types of recurring characters, otherwise known as an archetype. These archetypes stem from characters that after making their debut have been the foundations for future incarnations, either functioning as the same class, having similar personality traits, playing otherwise identical roles in the story, you get the idea, and Fire Emblem has been using a lot of these over the years. Now I imagine to some this may come off as a bit lazy, however in all fairness, you can't really expect the developers to make well over 100 characters that aren't even remotely similar, and personally I think a good chunk of these archetypes have made for some of the best characters in the entire franchise, or at the very least a long line of good ones, and there are 10 in particular who have truly stood the test of time. So join me everyone, as it's time to look to the past in order to build a brighter future, as I count down my top 10 Fire Emblem archetypes. As is tradition, this video is purely my opinion and I'm ranking these archetypes in terms of which are my favourite, so feel free to disagree if you're not too fond of these familiar faces. The ranking system for this list pretty much boils down to how much I like what each archetype represents, as well as the characters who embody their attributes. So this is a much more subjective list, but if you're interested as to what all the archetypes are and who falls into them, a quick trip to the Fire Emblem wiki will give you all the answers. And with all that cleared up, let's say we get a move on and celebrate the characters that never get old, as well as celebrating all of you who follow me on Twitter. All 1,000 of you. The GHARNEF archetype. Yes, Fire Emblem villains are no stranger to archetypes too, and since the franchise comes under the fantasy genre, it's no shock that the power-hungry sorcerer would exist in this universe. Yes, it's not very original, but then again, nothing is these days. While not one of the strongest archetypes in my opinion, and a bit formulaic, the GHARNEF type character works as a solid foundation for a lot of Fire Emblem villains, and has harboured some of my favourite villains and characters to date, showing that this world is never short on surprises. After all, Lyn being in Warriors was something I did not see coming. But man am I glad it happened! The character GHARNEF originated from Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, and played the role of the mastermind manipulating the events that took place, working behind the scenes and pulling all the strings. The scoundrels that follow GHARNEF's example are present very often throughout the story and tend to be the instigators of the conflict, making them arguably the most essential parts of the narrative. Despite their imperativeness, most of the time I find their motivations to be rather basic, primarily wanting to resurrect some form of dark entity or dragon god, which for all intents and purposes works, but does get a little old after a while. Although a bit on the cliche side, I'd say it does make for an effective villain 9 times out of 10, being a catalyst for the main character to stop the war, along with pushing them to their limit and testing their resolve and determination. A good chunk of characters from this archetype, I will admit, are pretty by the numbers. However, there are quite a few diamonds in the rough. After all, Nagal is both a disgustingly evil, but also rather complex villain, and both Leon and Sephiroth are some of the most sympathetic and tragic characters in Fire Emblem, the former of which being in my opinion the best character from this archetype, only wanting to do good, but are brought down by the weight of the world around them. First world Fire Emblem problems. These characters also act as pretty big obstacles for the end of the game, being significantly powerful and quite the challenge if you're not prepared, though some of them are certainly on the easier end of the spectrum. And though this archetype just barely made the list, it still lays out solid groundwork to add to the Fire Emblem Rogues Gallery. It's like Felicia says,
whatever works!
The GOTOH archetype. Fire Emblem stories have a reputation for being well written and nicely tied together various themes and philosophies. Most of the time. But ultimately, they're about the Lord's journey to save the world, and every strapping young hero needs a mentor figure in their lives. This is where GOTOH comes in, and all the wise men and women that followed his example, as they serve as the ones the Lords look up to and prepare them for the journey ahead, not to mention coming in right at the end to show that these old dogs still know a few new tricks. It seems age truly does come before beauty. GOTOH also originated in Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and acted as master guide throughout a good chunk of the game. The purpose of this character is pretty obvious, and more often than not, they're very involved in the story, as well as being rather close to the main characters. Because of their roles in the game, most of them are very wise and knowledgeable, but also stern and strict, which is to be expected. And though this all sounds stereotypical, Fire Emblem is once again able to shine at what it does best, as I've seen many GOTOHs that I feel are strong characters with bold personalities, some of which are very lively and upbeat. You'd swear they weren't a day over 20. The appearance of these advisors can be rather sporadic depending on the game, since Flavio and Basilio appear very early on, yet Corel doesn't arrive until the very end, though personally I'd say they're usually there long enough to be a large part of the narrative, and once they decide to join the fight, good lord they hit the ground running. The effectiveness of a GOTOH character can range from competent to downright insane. For the most part, they join the group with high bases and have shockingly good growth rates too, making for some overall very powerful fighters and perfect replacement units, and though truth be told some of them aren't amazing like Myson, others like Kanagas are literal beasts and should not be overlooked, which is precisely why he's my favourite of the GOTOHs. The hero's journey is one of strife, courage and sacrifice, and behind every legendary hero is a figure that helps shape them into who they are, so whenever there's a Fire Emblem Lord, a GOTOH archetype will be right behind them. The Pegasus Sisters archetype. This archetype has always been a funny one for me. I mean, Pegasus Knights are still my second favourite class in Fire Emblem, so having this trope in any game otherwise spoils me for choice. However, I've begun to notice that over time, they've been featured less and less, not counting echoes. I guess everything wears out its welcome eventually. Well, even if they're starting to be pushed to the side, I've always admired the family dynamic they represent and how these splendid sisters look out for each other. Though I always wondered why all of them became Pegasus Knights. Was it by choice or did their parents decide it for them? That's gotta be a strange support conversation. The three sisters that started this trend, Palla, Katria and Est, originated in Shadow Dragon and were unique for being able to perform the special triangle attack move. Since up until Fate all Pegasus Knights were female only, it made sense to use this archetype for future games. After all, the triangle attack is really cool and makes up for one of the class's biggest shortcomings, and having the characters be sisters justifies the use of this ability. Even though these siblings are birds of a feather, most of the time they're very spread out over the course of the entire campaign, and usually they have to be recruited by talking to them with another sibling. Heck, in Blazing Sword you can't get all three sisters unless you play Hector mode, which I always took as a way of encouraging the player to use Pegasus Knights more often, and that's something I can get behind. While I imagine for most people the triangle attack is the main appeal of this archetype, for me, it's the characters and their relationship I get the most out of. Staying true to their origins, you get the typical Palla-like sister who's the most mature and level-headed, you have the Katria sister who's a lot more stern and cold, and finally there's the Est sister who's usually the youngest and is just so upbeat and cheerful. Regardless of screaming copy and paste, many Pegasus Knights have been able to stand on their own as unique characters, and usually different trios will tackle different types of family affairs, which I admire, my favourite of which being Fiora, Foreigner and Forina from Blazing Sword. Unfortunately, this archetype has become scarcer in future games as it wasn't present in Awakening or Fate, but at the very least it's had its time in the sun, and I'll always be happy to see a new trio of lovely ladies at any given time. Let's hope Fire Emblem Switch can bring them back in full force. The Rudolf archetype. Once again, we have another archetype for the bad guys, only instead of a power-hungry sorcerer, we've got a power-hungry subjugator, which when you think about it is not too different, but hey, whatever works. Personally, I'm a bigger fan of this archetype, as the characters embody certain concepts of Fire Emblem I find much more fascinating, grounded, and contemporary. Most of the time. So it's more a case of me favouring what the archetype represents, not necessarily who's a part of it, if that makes any sense. How's this for a change of pace? The Rudolf archetype originated in Fire Emblem Gaiden. For once, Shadow Dragon isn't the source of everything Fire Emblem related. This type of villain appears a lot in the series, and more often than not, it makes for some pretty good antagonists. Unlike the GHARNEF archetype who are motivated by the need to summon or call forth a godlike entity, most Rudolf villains are purely out for themselves, wanting to start war for the purpose of domination and enforcing their worldviews. So with them, it's not about working behind the scenes or doing it for a deity, they simply charge in headfirst and assert their dominance. Sometimes it's because of the need to eliminate future wars, other times it's due to a lack of faith in humanity. Some people are fueled by the principles of the strong devouring the weak, others want to instill peace through any means necessary, and some men just want to watch the world burn. Due to these more grounded ideologies, I feel like they have a more human element to them, and sometimes the things they say and do have a significant amount of weight, making it so that in some cases I question whether or not they're really the bad guys, or at the very least I can understand the motivations behind their actions. I'm also a big fan of the way these characters look, as they're often huge in size and draped in head to toe in some of the most regal and intimidating armor ever. Garen looks like he'll eat you, which in my opinion adds a much greater sense of dread and makes the inevitable confrontations all the more extraordinary, which can range from piss poor to some of my favourite fights in the franchise, as well as being in my opinion the 7th best archetype in Fire Emblem, which doesn't surprise me considering this guy is what I feel to be the best character this trope has produced. The CAIN and ABEL archetype. And now we come to what I consider the poster boys of the Fire Emblem archetype, as this is one of the longest running and most commonly featured in the series, so naturally they were going to be on this list, and they've more than earned their place. Personally, I have yet to see anyone based on this archetype to be some of the best written or strongest units in each game, but to be fair, I don't think they're meant to be, instead serving their purpose as units I can always count on and characters I enjoy to have around, so while not the best, you simply can't beat a classic. Both CAIN and ABEL were some of the earliest units you obtained in Shadow Dragon, and this archetype has been present in just about every Fire Emblem game since, even going so far as to use identical colour schemes. Hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, am I right? The purpose of CAIN and ABEL are to act as early game units that are very well rounded and reliable, making it easy for players to use them in whatever way possible and keep them around until the very end if they like. Around 80% of the time, these characters are of the Cavalier class. However, in some cases there are exceptions, such as Kaze and Saito being ninjas, and Lucas and Forsyth being knights. One thing that mostly remains the same is the stat distribution, as CAINs tend to have higher strength, whereas ABELs have higher speed and skill, though the difference isn't massive and in some cases the stats are switched. Their personalities are something that has a habit of staying the same however, as CAINs have a reputation for being much more serious and focused, in contrast to ABELs that are far more relaxed and easygoing, which I will say has led to some of these characters feeling a little flat and unoriginal, but over time I've noticed how much they've evolved into significantly more dynamic people. In regards to which I prefer, I lean more towards the ABELs since characters like Sain and Kaze I simply adore, but the CAINs have had their moments too, especially with Sully and Kieran around. Regardless, this particular archetype is as old as Fire Emblem itself, and if history is any evidence, it's not going away anytime soon. The Maria archetype. When out on the battlefield, you can't go very far without medical assistance. Unless you're Seth, but he's a special case. And while there's plenty of saints and clerics in Fire Emblem, in my opinion, troubadours are where it's at, and so is the Maria archetype. This is one of the more interesting tropes in my opinion, since while in regards to gameplay they all function rather similarly, their characters vary greatly over the course of the series, as I find a decent chunk of them to be radically different from each other, and less likely to succumb to a set of cliches, which is quite the feat considering the majority of archetypes the series has produced, so colour me impressed. For the, 5th time, yet another archetype originated from Shadow Dragon. Get used to hearing that on this countdown, folks. When breaking down the Maria archetype, I've noticed that it consists of 3 main factors. 1. The unit is a healer, often a troubadour. 2. They are siblings to another unit in the game. And 3. They are of noble blood. Granted, this doesn't apply to everyone since Mist isn't a noble, Maribel doesn't have a playable sibling, and Maria herself isn't a troubadour, but that's the general outline, and for what it's worth, these characters usually end up becoming my favourite healers. From a gameplay perspective, I favour these units compared to the typical laner trope, as despite joining later, they often have mounted utility, which is very beneficial, along with often having a better speed stat and growth, in addition to be some of the most evasive units in the game, or at least when I use them. In regards to character, it's amazing to see just how many different personalities are present within this one archetype. When you've got characters as refined as Priscilla and Ethelyn, self-centered yet fascinating as Maribel, Lachesis and Clarine, pure and innocent as Maria and Mist, along with Elise being just the cutest little thing in the world and my absolute favourite of the bunch, it's easy to see why I'm so fond of this trope. Not to mention, a lot of them have supports I really like that tend to be the best things about them. Archetypes will always come with a set of guidelines to follow when using them as the basis for new characters. However, there's nothing stopping you from changing things up and being a bit more experimental, and if the Maria archetype isn't a prime example as to why, then I don't know what is. The Navarre archetype. Fire Emblem has always favoured winning the hearts of your enemies to fight for your cause, and Navarre was pretty much the first character to start this trend. Well, one of them. This archetype has a reputation for producing some very potent units just about any player would be a fool to pass up, and I have also been a big fan of the characters too, as despite frequently being people of very few words, I'm always interested in finding out more about them, though I doubt they're simply willing to open up to people instantly, though I can think of someone who can get them to, open up to him.
Giggity, giggity, giggity.
Navarre is once again an archetype that originated from Shadow Dragon and takes the form of an enemy unit, usually a Myrmidon, that you can recruit. Navarre units are some of the most dangerous early game enemies you'll encounter, so don't be surprised if they take you down in a single round. However, if you tip the scales in your favour, then they quickly become some of the strongest units for that point in the game. Most Navarres are very fast and skillful, along with having high evasion, good damage output, but ultimately being rather frail, so despite some setbacks, I say they're overall good units, especially since most of them join with a killing edge for their added potency. As a matter of fact, some like Xerath come in with a skill adept, and Ira has Astra starting out. Not even Ryoma starts with something that good. In regards to characterization, they're not much for exchanging dialogue and can be rather hostile. But I found that supporting with these characters often led to some remarkable conversations that either explored more about them or showed a different perspective on the current situation or conflict. Plus, some of these characters actually play a rather sizable part in the narrative. Isn't that right, Joshua? Figures you'd be my favourite of the bunch. Fire Emblem has yet to tell a story where war is simply a case of black and white, though these two games came dangerously close to doing so. And until then, we'll always have enemy units that aren't what they seem, and trust me when I say, it is in your best interest to see what the Navarre archetype has to offer. The Oife archetype. This has to be the biggest case of mistaken identity ever, since if I were to describe to you a character that fit the role of an early game pre-promote, I wager a good chunk of people would have thought of Jagan. While yes, these factions are key elements of the Jagan archetype, Oife shares these characteristics too, only in my opinion, they're much better, as characters befitting of this archetype can be potent throughout the entire game and have a significant presence within the narrative. Such a shame that they sometimes get overlooked in favour of a similar class or unit type. Now I know how Setsuna and Perry feel, though for what it's worth, I'm happy to have you both on my Fates teams, so long as it isn't Revelations. Oife first appeared in Fire Emblem 4 Genealogy of the Holy War. Hey look, that makes 2 not from Shadow Dragon. And this archetype has been frequently used for the more recent early game pre-promotes. The main difference between an Oife and a Jagan is that starting out, Jagans tend to have very strong base stats, but also very low growth rates, that make them great at the beginning, but less effective the further you go along. Oifes also have a tendency to start with strong base stats, and their growth rates are higher as well, making them units that can be useful from beginning to end, which I much prefer, and it possibly makes them some of the most useful units in their respective games. In my case, Titania and Seth were with me at all times, along with Soph, but that's more to do with the fact that the Door Brigade can't survive part 1 without him. Oifes are also featured regularly throughout the story and give their input on the events taking place, acting as the mentor figure or guardian. After all, Oife was present in both parts of Genealogy, Marcus had quite a few scenes with Eliwood, Seth is what I consider the best Oife in Fire Emblem and was practically one of the main characters in Sacred Stones, and this applies to Titania and Soph too in terms of the narrative importance. Frederick never left Crom's side for a minute, and both Felicia and Jacob followed Corin regardless of which path was taken, so it's reassuring to know that whenever there's an Oife archetype in whichever game, from start to finish, they'll always have my back. The CAMUS archetype. Loyalty is an aspect commonly featured within Fire Emblem, and the CAMUS archetype has so much of it, you couldn't even sway them with a mint condition copy of Path of Radiance. This sense of devotion, in my opinion, makes them some of the more interesting characters that help to show the war from a different perspective, and the consequences of one's actions, though sometimes they take their loyalty a little too far. Look Xander, every one of your siblings has abandoned you, Hoshido is at your doorstep, and your father is an asshole. Why do you continue to serve him? Alas, I am a victim of fate's shitty writing. The CAMUS archetype originated in the original Shadow Dragon. Big shock, I know. As an enemy unit who was unique for being an adversary, I actually thought twice about killing. CAMUS type characters will more often than not show no ill will towards you or your team and may in fact even have loved ones that are on your side. However, they will fight to the bitter end out of loyalty for their lord or nation, even with the knowledge that they will die and what they're doing isn't right. This type of character goes to show just how ambiguous the motives surrounding the war are. Being very earnest and noble people I cannot help but admire and respect, which makes it all the more tragic when I have to eventually take them down, resulting in some rather emotional encounters and bittersweet endings. I believe that this trope makes for some of the more interesting Fire Emblem villains. After all, Nina beseeched me not to take down CAMUS, Eldegan was a dear friend I dared not to lose, Selena is one of the Sacred Stone's tragic trio, Shiharan put the safety of his daughter in Ike's hands, Leviel was one of the few in Benyon who wasn't complete filth, and Birthright Xander, thankfully isn't canon. Without a doubt in my mind, my absolute favourite versions of this archetype are the Wyvern Generals from Binding Blade. Murdoch, Brunia and Gale were characters that throughout the story were shown to be fully loyal to Sephiel and some of the most humble and honourable adversaries ever. Their conversations were some of my favourite parts of Binding Blade, and even when facing off against the traitor Milady, there was no hatred or contempt towards her, making it so that when they died, a little part of me did as well. Fire Emblem is always going to be about war and showing the struggle from various perspectives, and as long as the CAMUS archetype is standing in our way, it will forever remind us that in war, there are no winners, only losers. Before we get to number 1, I'd like to do some honourable mentions. First up is the Ogma archetype. Much like their respective class, Ogmas are some of the most reliable and well-rounded units in the game, along with quite the cool cast of characters too, especially Garrick, Deke and Saber. Next up is the Est archetype. One of the more well-known archetypes, Ests are low-level units that joined rather late into the game, but have high growth rates and potential, making them risk versus reward units that can be very enthralling to train, as well as strangely, having some of my favourite characters from their respective games, like Nino and Alicia. After that, there's the Michaelis archetype. Though Fire Emblem is known for complex and morally grey villains, sometimes you just need a power-hungry malicious scumbag who loves every second of causing people pain, something this archetype knows all too well, and sometimes makes for characters you just love to hate, like Kaliak and Narcian. Moving on, we have the George archetype. They say that people are more than what they seem, as from the get-go these characters come off as simple travellers, but later down the line they turn out to be some of the most important characters in the entire game, like Ninian and Nils. I guess everyone really does wear a mask. And finally, there's the Aaron and Samson archetype. Fire Emblem has made it clear that your choices matter, and these units are shining examples as to why, as per playthrough you only get access to one of them, adding quite a bit of replay value, though personally I find some of the choices to be a little one-sided, like in regards to Echidna and Barta, or Sonia and Dean. Anyway, with that out of the way, on to the number 1 entry. The Minerva archetype. The moment I pitched the idea for this list, I knew deep down Minerva was going to win, and when taking into consideration all the Wyvern riders that followed in her footsteps, it only solidified her place at the very top. For years, this type of character has a reputation for being powerful units in each game, and in my opinion, some of the best characters too, to the point in which I believe this archetype can otherwise do no wrong. It seems Miss Minerva is as timeless as they come. For the final time, Minerva originated in the very first Fire Emblem game, where she was an enemy Wyvern rider that soon became an ally, and this holds true for the other characters of this trope, the majority of which are female and don red armor. What makes these characters especially good to me is how they embody one of the most crucial aspects of Fire Emblem, since the series is about showing the reality of war and how not everyone is simply evil, which is where the Minerva archetype truly shines, as you get to see what people from the opposing side are really like, as well as their reasons for fighting both for and against you. This not only acts as a strong premise for a character template, but I find that the best types of Minervas are some of the most three-dimensional characters in their games. I felt that Minerva was one of the most fleshed out units in Shadow Dragon. I noticed how huge of a role Milady played in Binding Blade and had some truly fascinating conversations. I thought Cormac had a great revenge arc and supports in Sacred Stones. Jill is what I consider to be one of the best written characters in the franchise and the best version of this archetype, and Camilla, well, when she's not talking about Corin, I find her to be incredibly endearing, and her backstory is really interesting stuff. In just about every Fire Emblem game, these characters often become some of my favourites, and the same goes for units as well. On the whole, Minervas have a tendency to be considerably strong, though the overall usefulness varies from game to game. In the original Shadow Dragon, Minerva was a strong unit, Altina made for a great physical attacker, Milady is a great unit who's really good on hard mode with those bonuses, and even Zeiss can be very strongly leveled up, and god damn that hard mode strength stat! Heath and Vida were pretty decent, Cormac kicked all kinds of ass, Jill in both games has a rough start but quickly becomes fantastic, and do I even need to talk about Har and Camilla? Both units can last through the entirety of Radiant Dawn and Conquest, and are otherwise essential for chapters like Alincia's Gambit and Unhappy Reunion, so no matter the game or unit, the ones who follow in Minerva's footsteps have never let me down. When all is said and done, Fire Emblem archetypes exist as a backbone for an assortment of entities, and while all of them have their strengths and weaknesses, the Minerva archetype stands as my favourite in the entire franchise, blessing me with both captivating characters and unbelievable units, as well as, in my opinion, personifying the themes and ideas of Fire Emblem better than anyone else, which is why they take the number 1 spot as my favourite Fire Emblem archetype. This has been BLAZINKNIGHT. I wish you all a great night, take care, and while Fire Emblem can't always make original and inventive characters, whenever they feel the need to use a tried and true template, you can be sure that these audacious archetypes will deliver A-grade material. Thank you all for watching today, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to tell me your thoughts in the comments on what your favourite Fire Emblem archetypes are and why, as well as what you thought of my choices and what are some of your favourite characters from the archetypes I selected. Once again, thank you all very much for watching. Be sure to give this video a like as it really helps out the channel and it means a lot to me, and also consider subscribing if you like these types of videos and want to see more. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Amino at BLAZINKNIGHT if you want to keep updated with what I'm doing or just have a friendly chat with me, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Anyway, that's it from me. I'll see you all next time.